So welcome everyone to the webinar. For today's session, we have Dr. John Cater presenting from Cells to Clouds, Fluid Mechanics at Scale. John is a member of the Department of Engineering Science at the University of Auckland, and we're really pleased he's here sharing his research with us today. But before I pass things over to John, I'm just going to cover a few housekeeping items. So if you're not asking a question or speaking, we do ask that you keep your audio on mute during the webinar. But if you do have a question at any point in time, you can use the chat, but you can also use the question document that I have prepared. And I'm just going to post that in the chat now. You might want to use that just so that your question doesn't get lost in the chat. So let me send it to everyone. So that link that I just posted, that's the question document, and you can put your comments, questions in there. And if we don't get to it during the talk itself, we will have opportunities for questions at the end. And then lastly, the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the NeSI website in the next few days. So those of you who registered for the webinar will get an email when that content has been uploaded. And it's kind of nice to see people on video. So if you're feeling up to it, please turn your video on. Otherwise, if you don't want to be accidentally in the recording, you might want to keep your video off. And you do that by clicking the icon on the bottom left of your screen. So with that out of the way, I am going to pass things over to John. Welcome, John.
And I'll share my video and audio as well.
Awesome.
Just a second there. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name's John Cater, and as Megan said, I'm in the Department of Engineering Science, which is an applied mathematics department here at the University of Auckland. And I just wanted to recognise some of my colleagues who are a big part of these activities that I'm going to be talking about today. So what I'm going to present is basically an overview of a bunch of projects that have run on NeSI over the last 10 or 12 years. And these people, Stuart Norris in Mechanical Engineering, Richard Clark in Engineering Science, and Vinod Suresh in the Auckland Bioengineering Institute have all contributed largely to these studies. So thanks very much for coming along. So I thought I'd start out by giving some kind of broad overview of the kind of stuff I do. So I've been working in high performance computing, that's HPC, since about 1998. First of all in Australia and then the UK, and then returned to New Zealand in 2008 and became a user of BestGrid, which was the precursor to NeSI, and then NeSI 1 and 2. And what I study is computational fluid mechanics. That's something that uses HPC resources everywhere. It's a big user, and I'm going to say why. It's a big user of computational resources. The kinds of projects I do split into two parts, or two types. The first is biomedical flows, and that's driven by two things. One is I'm actually downstairs from the Auckland Bioengineering Institute, and I have many collaborators there. And also because a lot of work I do, particularly consulting or contractual work, is for Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, which is a large medical device supplier in Auckland. So those biological fluids, this is where the cells part of the title comes from. It goes from very small things, cells moving in capillaries and veins, to medical devices. The other thing I do, really I'm an aerospace engineer. And when I returned to New Zealand, I used to work on aircraft engines. When I returned to New Zealand, I realized that there wasn't much of a group looking at aircraft and rockets. So I turned my attention to wind farms, and New Zealand has a great potential for wind farm energy production. And I've been looking at things including the performance and noise from individual turbines, and how you might control and use an entire farm of turbines. I also need the standard disclaimer for all this work. So I've said there are 25 projects. Each of these projects has involved at least one, probably two, and maybe 4 or 6 postgraduate students over the years. And they do the actual work. my job is to ask them, do your results make sense? So the problem, what these fluid flows all have in common is that they're subject to these governing equations called the Navier-Stokes equations. I deliberately put this in here to scare you if you're not familiar with it, but if you are, it might scare you still. So there are a number of different parts, and these are relevant to how we go about solving the problem. This equation tells us that there's something to do with time. Yeah, we've got something that evolves in time, and we're interested in this quantity, the velocity or the momentum of a fluid flow. And this is a function of space. Yeah, and that's what these symbols are telling us. So there are gradients in space. So this problem, when we solve fluid flow problems in general, it's usually hyperbolic. What that means is we need initial conditions as well as boundary conditions, and we propagate them through time. So we use time stepping. So we can't solve the end of the problem until we've solved the start and we've taken steps. Yeah? And so that necessitates long duration simulations or models. They're going to take place over some period. The other thing to note is that there's often a lot of different length scales. So a lot of different sizes, could be of geometry, could be of physical scales in the flow. And that's going to determine how much memory our computation is going to take. So those length scales tell us about how much resolution we need, how many points in space, how much memory we require, and the time scales tell us about how many steps we're going to take, how much CPU time is going to be required. Okay, another equation, I'm afraid. So this is characterized by something called the Reynolds number. Many of you will be familiar with the Reynolds number. Essentially, it's a ratio of the biggest scales to the smallest scales present, both in space and time. And the cost, I've written there something about the computational cost. What I'm really saying is here is the bigger your problem, the more computational effort it's going to take to solve. And it goes like something like Reynolds number cubed. And I've put here that the state of the art in direct simulation, so solving these equations on a discretized volume, the best you can do it now is about 10 to the 4, maybe pushing 10 to the 5 these days. Flows that we're interested in, particularly me as an aerospace engineer, tend to be in the millions. So that's 20 times 10 to the 7. Sorry for the typo there. Or tens of millions. So flow over an Airbus aircraft would be something like up to 60 million. And that's not, on a desktop PC, that's not feasible. And it won't be feasible for at least 20 years, probably more. And my line there is that means that for people doing CFD, there's job security for the next little while. Yeah. But the problem is, if we want to solve these problems and physical situations with these high Reynolds numbers, we need a way to deal with it. Okay. So the first way to deal with these problems is to simplify the equations and to say to ourselves, well, instead of solving everywhere in space at every point in time, can we do less? Yeah? And one method that we use to do that is called the boundary element method, that essentially solves analytical integral equations on the surface of a domain or a problem. And then we can use that to find the solution everywhere. It works when things are nice and linear. So that's problems like acoustic propagation of acoustic waves, electromagnetic waves, Wi-Fi signals, contact mechanics, fracture mechanics, that kind of thing. So it only really works at low Reynolds numbers. And the example I'm going to show is flow through a capillary. So this is something that exists. You've got networks of hundreds of thousands of these things in your body. They have a lumen, think of that as the pipe through which the blood flows, and cells also pass through the center of the lumen. So this is an example of a solution using the boundary element method, and it comes from Pavel Summit's PhD graduate with Richard Clark. What's happened here is that we've formed these really complicated boundary integral equations for a particular geometry, in this case, a nice sinusoidally varying or varicose capillary. And inside is a representation of a white blood cell. So I've put up the top of each of the slides what was used to do it. So this was actually implemented in MATLAB, parallel MATLAB using about 16 cores, and took a couple of days of computing to get a solution. But what we get out of this is the flow field, where the velocity, where the fluid is going throughout the domain, the stresses on the layers near the wall, something called the EGL, and the stresses, the surface stresses or shear stresses on the white blood cell as it moves through. So this is a really good solution of the problem, but it's limited by the fact we have to make some pretty heavy restrictions on the problem itself. the fact that this is sinusoidally varying is important. To do it generically for different geometries makes the maths much more complicated. We end up, in this problem, we end up solving dense matrices, and this means that the size of these matrices depends on the number of elements that we have, so the surface elements around the edge squared. So that means as soon as we get to a reasonable size or a small discretization, we have an n squared problem here, and these problems are going to go very big, and the cost is going to grow large as well. So the other way to do things is what's called domain decomposition. Here we take our volume and we chop it up into bits. And each of these parts we solve an approximation of the Navier-Stokes equation in a small volume, and then at one time, and then we increment time and solve it all again at the next time using the previous step as our initial condition. So this is a large sparse matrix problem. And the good thing about this is that it can be distributed more efficiently across lots of cores on an HPC. The only problem is, first of all, how to initialize our solutions, and second of all, how to discretize the domain. Typically, we're discretizing based on the mesh or the geometry somehow. What's shown here is I don't know if you can see this, but we're modeling downwind sailing. So there's a tiny little racing boat there with some sails on it. I don't know if you can see my mouse. In each part of this domain, we need a different type of mesh with a different density. So unfortunately, we end up handcrafting that mesh and then splitting that entire domain into mesh regions. And so you can see a finer mesh. There's something happening at the walls. There's a finer mesh again, and then a very fine surface mesh. Fine near the sail, because that's where the smallest length scales are going to be present, where things are happening most quickly at the smallest scale. Okay. And this works well for steady or nearly steady problems. The downside is, and so this is using something called ANSYS Fluent, for those who use Fluent. The downside is that there is a lot of handcrafting of this mesh. A picture here of the mesh. There's lots of special regions, and each of these points and surfaces has been done by hand. So it actually takes days of work to get a good mesh for this kind of problem. In this case, it's a couple of years old, but it used 96 cores and a couple of weeks of runtime to get a time-resolved solution. Okay, so that would be the standard way. This would be the kind of CFD that you'd use in an undergraduate course. The time resolution, running it for long enough, is probably not something you can do on a PC. You need an HPC. This time has probably come down a bit. You can probably do it in 8 days now. Okay, so those simple kind of CFDs, you can see we've been using Fluent, this commercial package. Unfortunately, there are other things going on, and each of these makes it incrementally more expensive to solve our fluid flow problems. So the flow around a sail or water in a channel has a single fluid, and it's typically a moderate Reynolds number. Even for high Reynolds number for air around an airfoil, for example, commercial codes have been highly optimized for this problem, but they still take a long time. Things get more complicated when the physics gets more complicated. So I'm just going to show you an example of each of these different situations. So if we have an additional fluid in the domain, okay, we need to keep track of where that fluid is and the interfaces between fluids. So we can have mixtures, non-interacting or interacting mixtures of fluids. If we have different phases, so I've given there the example of liquid and gas, again, we need to keep track of the interfaces, but each of those phases might have different constraints on the time step because of the speed at which pressure and changes propagate in that fluid. If there's a thermodynamic process, we need to solve some extra equations. So typically the energy equation, if there's thermal effects, heating and cooling and so forth. But if there's some kind of chemical process as well, we're going to need to solve additional transport equations. So equations that require time stepping and stepping in space for those processes. And they might be much faster than everything else going on in the fluid. So they might be the constraint on how quickly we can progress time in our simulations. Acoustics is a special case, and something I do is aeroacoustics, and there's a group here at the University of Auckland that computes the noise or the sound from fluid flows. So they have a special way of handling them, and again, an additional equation. And then I guess the really hard problems are those that include solids and fluids together. And the reason for this is that I've sort of mentioned it, but the speed at which pressure information spreads throughout a domain, formally it's the speed of sound in the medium. So if we have air, 340 meters a second, if we want to catch that propagation, that moving pressure wave, we need to take small enough steps in time and space that we can resolve that propagation. When we have solids, the speed of sound is much higher. So we need to take much smaller steps. So that class of problems where a flow is exerting a force on a solid, and then the solid is moving in response to the fluid, and that motion is changing the fluid flow, that's called FSI, or fluid structure interaction. And the last group of problems there is when we have things that are transported by the flow, and they might be passive or they might be active. That means they might just move where the flow goes, or they may be interacting with the flow or each other in some complicated way. And again, they tend to be at much smaller length scales and time scales than the rest of the flow, and they're going to make our computation more expensive. So the first flow I'm going to show you is one for work done in collaboration with Fisher & Paykel Healthcare. Scream at me if the movie doesn't show. So this is a case, okay, thanks. This is a case of fluid flow, mixed gases, yeah? And in red, we're seeing the concentration of CO2 during an exhalation when a respiratory therapy called nasal high flow is applied. So we're able to keep track of these gases. You can see it's being diluted. The CO2 is being diluted by an inflow of oxygen and nitrogen through the therapy. I just like looking at the movies. And what's of interest here is how fast CO2 is being removed, because that's one of the important things when using this therapy. Okay. Here's a recent example of two fluids. So this is a geothermal flow. In New Zealand, we have wet geothermal sources. So what that means is when we get steam from the ground, it's a combination of what's called dry steam, so water gas, and droplets, so condensed droplets. And when we put them through pipes, what happens is that the water tends to fall to the bottom and run along the bottom surface of the pipe. And some of it stays suspended, but some of it flows along the bottom, and it's moving at a different speed from the gas above. So the gas is moving here from left to right, and the water is flowing along the bottom. What we're looking at in this study is the effect of a flow restriction from an orifice plate at the bottom of a pipeline. So this is work with contact energy. And it turns out that if you put a little lip there, this inhibits the flow of liquid and changes the flow quite dramatically. Okay. Here's another biomedical flow. And so this is current work with a student called Hussein. We're interested in surgical flows, and this is, for the case of laparoscopy, primarily gallbladder removal. So what happens in these situations is that an incision is made, a scope is put into your middle, and an instrument, which here it's called a monopolar hook, but it's essentially an electrode. This forms a circuit when it touches the tissue with your body. That's another in the circuit. And when that happens, current flows, and a piece of tissue is cauterized. Yeah? It's cut or it's burnt. And the problem here is that when doing this surgery, the wound fills up with smoke. Yeah? So there are products of the tissue burning, and they stay inside the wound, and they make it hard for the surgeon to see what's going on. So in this case, we're trying to figure out how far we can see after what time, and how much flow should be pushed in. So there's a port to push fresh air or CO2 into the wound to try and push out some of the smoke. So I've given this diagram because I want to say that all these examples I'm giving, the CFD is never enough, and we are always relying on experimental data or measurements to validate our CFD. because when we're solving the Navier-Stokes equations, we almost never know the boundary conditions and the initial conditions with enough fidelity to have confidence in our solution from one solution. So we often either run a group of solutions and modify the initial conditions, or we use some, or as well, hopefully, we use some experimental measurements. So Paul Hussein has been using pieces of pig's liver in a box and filming the smoke inside. But he's also been doing some visualization of the smoke inside the wound. So this is the same box geometry you saw above. I know it doesn't look like anything's happening. What happens with the surgery is that the hook is touched to the liver in pulses of about 1 second long every 5 seconds. And what we have here is a dispersed phase. So, so this is smoke particles building up. There is actually an exhaust here, and you might be able to see it coming out the side. Oh, come on. You can see that some of the smoke exhausts here, and there is constant flow through the inlet. So this is an example of this two-phase flow. There's also temperature effects and water vapor produced by this pyrolysis. Okay, something a little more at the edge of pushing the boundaries a bit more. So there's a Marsden-funded project led by Richard Flay, which is current. And you can see that this is a result as of a couple of weeks ago, to extract energy from low, what we call low quality, low temperature geothermal sources. So the basic idea is that warm water is sprayed into an area and surrounded by veins. And this is purely notional, the geometry of these. And what happens is that warm water causes warm air to, or the air to warm and to rise, and that causes a plume, if you like, an atmospheric plume that rises up several kilometers into the atmosphere and swirls around and around. And so what's on the right is a very recent, as in yesterday, simulation of a buoyant vortex plume rising up through about 700 meters. So there we have to take account of other boundary conditions like Coriolis forces and so forth. So this is a much bigger, spatially bigger problem, a much bigger mesh. And for this, we're using an open source code called OpenFoam. I see that Michael McDonald's actually in on the call, so that's he's a co-investigator in this work. I talked about aeroacoustics before. So people don't like the noise from wind turbines, especially for onshore wind turbines. And so we did some work a few years ago about estimating the noise production from wind turbine blades and seeing if we could do something about it by changing the shape of the blades. Now, I've already said the flow over a wind turbine, or something that looks like an airfoil, this is maybe 2 to 6 million Reynolds numbers. So it's a very expensive simulation. The simulations typically take 2 to 4 weeks with 196 cores. So they're very expensive. And in that period, we can only simulate a small part of the blade. So what you're seeing here is a section of wind turbine blade. But if you look at the flow, these are isocontours of vorticity. You can see that there's lots of fine detail here. And we'd like to be able to not resolve that and to use a coarse mesh, but we can't because these fine details are responsible for acoustic waves or acoustic sources, which translates to frequencies at which humans are most sensitive. So we need all this computational resource to adequately capture the propagation of those that noise. What happens here is we split the problem into two. We first calculate the flow around this blade, and then we know that the noise predominantly comes from the surface of the blade. So it's actually the fluctuating pressure on the airfoil surface that gives rise to most of the noise. So we then take those sources, which were recorded throughout the simulation, and then propagate them in a wave propagation method out to receiver locations, so discrete receiver locations. So we don't try and find out the noise everywhere. We just choose a few points on the ground or where a person might be standing where we can integrate and find the noise at that point. Sorry. Okay, here's another tricky one. So this is again motivated by a New Zealand concern, which is the production of methane in ruminants. So this, believe it or not, is a picture of a sheep ruminant, a sheep stomach, a sheep rumen, which has a number of sections. And what's known is that the production of methane varies between individuals, but it's got something to do with the passage of different feed through different parts of the stomach. You feed the sheep differently, different methane is produced. So in this domain, this is representing the different parts of the rumen. There is this line here showing the liquid layer. So in here there is gas on top, what's called a gas cap, and underneath this is liquid. And what we've done is injected particles, bits of feed if you like, with different sizes and properties into this is called the reticulum. And we want to see how they move through the ruminant as digestion happens. So as rumination occurs, what happens is this changes shape. So this is an example of FSI. The boundaries here, once again, I know what a rumen feels like. We did both put our arms, and the research student here, Stephen Waite, who's now a postdoc, we asked him to put his arm into ruminants, and his supervisors did the same, show willing. And we did extract rumens from cadavers as well. So if you ever have the opportunity to feel a sheep's stomach, you'll know that it's very floppy. So this moves substantially during the process of rumination. There's essentially a wave, or two sets of waves that move, contraction waves that move along the rumen, and those shift the fluid, but also move the particles from one stomach, if you like, to the other. So here we go. We're letting go different particles with different densities. And what happens is that the reticulum, this part on the end here, contracts periodically. And you can sort of see the slower waves in the rest of the rumen. So what we're interested in is, for different size feed, where does it end up? Well, how long does it stay in each part of the stomach? So the other complication with this problem is that the flow, the gas is fine. It's just a discrete phase of gas above. But the flow here, the fluid, once again, you probably haven't had the chance, but digester is a non-Newtonian fluid. So what that means is that it behaves differently depending on how much shear it experiences. So it's not like water or air. It sometimes behaves like a solid, like a massive grass, if you like. It's been eating grass. And sometimes it behaves like a very thin liquid. It's mostly acetic acid. So when you have a non-Newtonian fluid, you have an additional equation which tells you about the stickiness versus, as a function of the flow everywhere. And this takes additional time to solve as well. I'm going to play it once more just because I like it. So again, this is using OpenFOAM, this open source solver. This is the reason for using this is because we have to implement our own physics to get good solutions in a reasonable time. But again, this is taking weeks on a parallel computer. The last one I want to show you is everything at once. This is a simulation of a gust moving through a wind farm. And this is using a custom, what's called a large eddy solver from Stuart Norris in Mechanical Engineering, done by a student, Rupert Story. Okay. So this shows the progression of a gust here in red moving through a wind turbine. An offshore wind farm here. This is everything at once because it includes an atmospheric boundary layer. Actually, each of those turbines in there and each of those blades is being simulated, and the controllers on each of those are being simulated. So the controller time step is very, very short. What we're seeing in the simulation, this is approximately twice real speed, but the time steps on the controllers are about 0.01 of a second. So also, if you would see that as the wind changes direction, the actual turbines are able to rotate as well. So we've got different types of fluid. We've got an atmospheric boundary layer. We have temperature gradients. We have roughness from the sea floor. We have fluid structure interaction. Actually, the blades are allowed to bend in response to the forces as well. So we have very fast timescales associated with those, and the towers can shake. So we haven't got any discrete particles in here. That's the only thing. But this is an enormously expensive simulation, and took about 2 months. What we're interested in is the response of the turbines to sudden changes in wind, and how we might optimize them to reduce the damage on the turbines. I'll let that finish. It's cool. Okay, so that's a bunch of pictures giving an overview from little cells to the atmospheric boundary layer. I wasn't sure about the audience today, so I'm going to take the chance to pontificate about a couple of points which I get worked up about. So the first thing, well, questions I often get asked about doing CFD on NeSI. So open source solvers. Absolutely. I think if you looked at those examples, you saw that back 5, 10, 15 years ago, we were using commercial solvers because it takes hundreds of thousands of hours to develop a robust Navier-Stokes solver that can handle a range of problems. So we were using commercial solvers, primarily ANSYS solvers. These days, people I work with, we're tending to use OpenFOAM, which is an open source fluid solver. It's customizable because you have the source code. It has a steep learning curve, probably a month to use the software, but it's getting better, and it's got much better over the last sort of 4 years. So I think in the future, we'll be using more OpenFOAM. We also use custom codes that we write. I write my own CFD codes. I'm sure Michael does as well, and Stuart Norris does as well. We do this where the physics aren't captured in an existing code. The really exciting problems in the future tend to be these fluid structure interaction ones, where we're interested in the forces between objects and the flow around them. And I think more of that's going to happen as NeSI and other HPC get more powerful. The one thing that we have been hamstrung by is just because of the cost of these solvers and the solution time it takes, that for the big solutions, they've been one-offs. And we really need to do a better job, in my opinion, as New Zealanders doing CFD, of running parametric studies. And I think with parallelization and more capacity, that becomes an option. I often get asked, why aren't we using the GPUs? Okay, so I've talked about spreading the load for these big matrix problems across cores, computational cores, and that with higher Reynolds numbers, you end up with larger meshes, which means tens of millions or hundreds of millions of cells. The problem in general with GPUs is that GPUs are great at solving linear matrix problems. The problem is that because we're time stepping, and each new step needs the information from all the rest of the domain. Now, at the new time step, we need the complete initial conditions at the next step for an incompressible flow or some approximation. What this means is that getting the data onto the GPU and getting it off again each time step becomes the constraint. And in general, for the kinds of CFD we do, it doesn't make sense to use GPUs. So we're users of a lot of cores all working very hard crunching numbers. The other thing I get asked about a lot is, why aren't you just doing a deep neural network and machine learning to solve these problems? Saves the parametric studies. So people have tried, and we've tried to some degree as well. It doesn't work very well because the training data, I mean, the predictions you get are only as good as the training data. And if you have new physics appearing, or a new boundary condition or some variation, your trained network does a very poor job at predicting. It tends to predict things like the things it's seen before. So I still think we don't have enough data to do a good job of training at least on turbulent flows. Okay, I think my time is about up. So thank you very much, everyone. I particularly want to thank all the students and the other staff that helped, and the NeSI support crew over the year. I think I saw that Jean was here somewhere, and Jean gets a special shout out as someone who's helped me and my colleagues and all the students over the last decade, and in fact has made it possible, gone out of his way. Okay, thanks very much.
Awesome. Thanks for that, John. That was really fantastic. I'm going to remind everyone in the room to pop your questions that you have into that question doc. I'll put the link one more time in the chat. We have maybe 5 or 6 minutes for questions. And so while I post that link, I'll just ask the first one. So do you have any recommendations or resources for people looking to learn OpenFOAM?
There is a wiki online that comes with OpenFOAM, and that's the first place most people start. It's not usually enough. It's not very good. So OpenCFD Online is a forum, and lots of people post their questions there and get pretty good answers.
Awesome. I'll see if I can find that link and put it in the resources bit of that question doc. So next, what are the biggest issues you found in moving code to NeSI?
Oh, in moving code to NeSI, I guess recently, or relatively recently, it was the authentication and that kind of nonsense. Sorry. They're logging into a node which is not actually the compute node, which then load to another node, and using a different authenticator from the rest of the university, and that was a problem. In terms of development, we tend to develop on local Linux machines, and if you can run some flavor of Red Hat, then it's simple to just recompile or transfer it to NeSI.
Awesome. Fantastic. And I wanted to ask, so do you have any tips for people looking to scale up their work if they don't have experience with using high performance computers? What would you suggest to someone that's new to the journey?
I would suggest that they're not let loose on NeSI. So actually, this is another problem we've had, is that people who are less experienced, maybe new PhD students or whatever, using a lot of resource, or using this cluster in a less efficient way than you could. So I know NeSI does run some training courses which are useful. I suggest these days everyone has a multi-core computer on them. So I suggest they try the parallel computing options on their desktop PC first and get an idea of how things are going to scale. So I said we use MATLAB in the past. It's got parallel computing capability these days. MPI, Microsoft has an implementation of MPI if you're on a Windows computer. Intel does. There's lots of different. So MPI is the message passing interface. It's used to communicate information between cores.
Fantastic. Yeah, so starting small and then kind of working your way up. Okay.
And also to get some help from the people at NeSI.
Yes.
So I'm not trying to advertise you, but I can't be bothered anymore, and I send students off to see the people at NeSI.
Oh, that's great. We are very glad to have questions, and I will reiterate that at the end when I do the wrap up, that we're always happy to get questions. So don't feel scared to engage with us. We are very happy to help you get on to NeSI. There's one more question. So what are some modern techniques to speed up multi-scale simulations, such as those found in meteorology or FSI problems?
Yes, yeah. FSI is a real toughie. So I'm going to go to meteorology. And I didn't mention that we also do some work on mesoscale models for wind resource. So there's a project looking at, for example, in the Pacific Islands. So what we use there is what's called multi-resolution methods. So we have a big domain which has got a coarse mesh. And we take the solution from that and use that as the boundary or initial conditions for a smaller, finer mesh. And there might be several levels of that, and depending on the physics, you might have to go back up as well. You might have to extrapolate your small domain again. But yeah, so that multi-resolution in CFD, sometimes it's called an overset mesh.
Fantastic. Okay, I think that's all of our questions. So I'm going to just share my screen one more time, do a little bit of a wrap up, and then send you guys on your way. So let me get that up.
I'm sorry I was so long. I said to Megan before we started, I can talk forever about nothing. So.
Oh, it wasn't. I loved all the videos. You did a fabulous job. I think everyone appreciated the length. So before you guys go, I did want to point out a couple things. But first of all, thank you, John, to the presentation. Really awesome job. I do like seeing all those animations and appreciated you showing them quite a few times. That was really good. But if you haven't noticed, there is a resources section at the top of the question document. At the moment, it just has some things like the support email for NeSI. So if you have any questions about if NeSI can help you, if that might be the right thing for your research, we are really happy to get emails from anyone, anytime. And you can check out recordings of our past webinars on our YouTube channel. The link is in that resource doc as well. We'll be posting the recording of this webinar there in the next few days. And if you want to get notified of other training events that we're running, you can sign up to our mailing list. And okay, actually, I think that's it. The recording will be posted. And one more thing before you go, I do want to highlight a service that NeSI provides that some of you could be interested in if you are already kind of into HPC. So NeSI has a team of research software engineers who can help you through a consultancy project if you're new to high performance computing and need help making the most of NeSI's platforms. And for researchers at most universities and CRIs, this consultancy service is provided at no cost to you, but you do need to reach out to us and tell us a little bit about your project, what you're kind of looking for help-wise. So if you think that could be something that you're interested in, do flick us an email at support@nessi.org.nz. So that's our discussion for today. Maybe unmute yourself and give John a thank you. That's the end of our session, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks, John.
Thanks very much, Megan. Great to see you.
Cheers.